Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me, right from the beginning, limit the scope of this study to my own experience as a teacher at the Higher Institute of Languages in the University of Gabes. I have taught American and British literature for almost 9 years, and today present among you to discuss challenges to teaching English literature to pre-service teachers. Before I start talking about the major challenges facing students in learning, and before discussing the whole process, teaching, learning process, I'd like first of all to have a look at the general context of this study, which is mainly built upon not very different contexts, and I mean here the international and the national contexts that shape our own vision of teaching and learning literature. These are what I call extrinsic factors related to teaching literature. Well, at the international level, humanities in general and literature in particular are completely neglected in the last 2 decades. This means that literature as a discipline is in crisis for the following reasons. Governments and decision makers do not believe anymore in the impact of the humanities on the marketplace. And accordingly, they do believe that from a purely marketing viewpoint, that business, IT, and applied sciences are productive areas. Moving to the national context, if you want, the national strategic planning in higher education in Tunisia is following the global trend. Humanities departments are stigmatized, in fact, through budget cuts, through the lack of logistics and lack of job opportunities, which leads us to talk about fragmented departments, and those humanities departments are most of the time merged, axed, or sometimes cut. This is my outline. Here in the remaining part of the presentation, I'll be discussing curricular aims and their major aspects, the challenges which are summed up in 2 major factors. The first is related to the L&D system and the curriculum design under the L&D system when it comes to the subject of literature, and as a second major factor or major challenge, it is related mainly to students' perception of literature, right? By the end, of course, I'll be proposing and exposing perhaps alternatives to those challenges. What should I be teaching and why? That's the initial question a teacher should think of. And to answer this question, I have worked on different curriculum aims. To learn to read a range of primary texts and text genres appropriately, to engage with the concepts and networks of ideas, to understand the way argument is conducted within literary discourse, to learn to speak and write within conventions, to foster creativity, critical thinking, and intercultural understanding, and be alert to the range and variety of approaches to literary study. Of course, the literature curriculum encompasses, according to me at least, it encompasses 4 major aspects, which are the following: the interpersonal, the knowledge, the experience, and the language aspects. I'll go through them one by one. So the first one is the interpersonal aspect, and here it is related to students' ability to present views and explain interpretations and evaluations of literary texts. It is also related to discussing literary texts in terms of themes, issues, language, and style. The second aspect is related to knowledge, required knowledge here. It takes into consideration, if you want, the ability to identify the major features of literary forms, to assimilate literary terms and concepts and apply them appropriately in appreciating, discussing, and evaluating literary texts. And it takes into consideration also the fact of understanding literary texts and establishing the interconnections within and between texts. The third aspect is related to the experience of the student and the way we should deal with students in the process of teaching literature, if you want. Here, gaining pleasure and enjoyment from reading and viewing literary texts is of a paramount importance. Teaching and learning literature is not only about the cognitive aims or the technical structures we are teaching to our students. It is rather also about a pleasure, about an experience, about enjoyment. After all, what is literature? I think that literature, or reading literature and learning literature, is a form of a symbolic kind of traveling, right? So here we should not leave aside the importance of this human experience. After all, literature is par excellence a human experience, and it connects different people all over the world, regardless of their culture, regardless of the differences between human beings. Accordingly, and because of a lack of time, I would be rather focusing on this multicultural dimension and the importance of the cultural training of students in order to appreciate literature and the factors that will facilitate their own learning, if you want. Developing creativity and critical thinking by engaging in tasks or activities which encourage learners to make predictions and inferences, descriptions, discussions, and debates through which learners express their critical analyses, personal views, and responses. The last aspect is also, before the last aspect, so here, as I said, in addition to the disciplinary and the cognitive goals, the teacher should be focusing on what we call the developmental goal behind teaching literature. By fostering intellectual growth, maturity of thought, social development, and emotional sophistication of reading literary texts. The last aspect, which is the language aspect, is dedicated to enhancing reading, comprehension, and interpretative skills, developing speaking and writing skills through oral or written presentations, developing awareness of the subtleties of language and of register. As a teacher of literature, I have faced, of course, many challenges related to two different problems, which are the following. The first is related, as I said, to the LMD system, whereas the second is related to students' perception of literature. In the first, related to the first factor, I'll be, if you want, discussing the system, or if you want, criticizing the system, the LMD system, as Dr. Yassine was giving a portrait of the major features of this system, if you want. The literature curriculum in the LMD system is divided into 6 semesters, with an average of 5 hours per week dedicated to literature. However, what is really depressing is that literature is most of the time based on lecturing. That's how we conceive of literature. That's how teachers mainly, when I say we, thank you, most of the teachers think of it as a subject where the teacher is lecturing and the students are receiving things, or I don't know, perhaps it's a one-way exchange. There's no exchange after all. right? So teaching literature is essentially based on lecturing. And of course, a lecture-based session leads to a teacher-centered approach, turning those students into mere recipients. Accordingly, the learning literature fosters reliance on the teacher's course. And that's what I have called the Prometheus syndrome. Teachers are not Promethean characters. We're not the givers of fire. We're not the givers of knowledge. And we shouldn't be perceived as such, because if we are perceived as Promethean characters, then our students will rely on us to give them everything. And this encourages a form of laziness, and it officially destroys any form of self-reliance when it comes to studying literature in general. So we have to be careful not to be taken for a Prometheus. The second element, which is quite depressing too, is this binary division when it comes to the chosen works taught to students, British or American literature. In this case, students are not exposed to the range of literatures in English. Think of Anglophone literature, for example. Think of other literatures which are excluded from the official curriculum. The third element is related to the load here. One work per semester. I think that one work per semester is not sufficient for the training of our students, because knowledge of literature should include a substantial number of authors and texts from different periods of literary history. Now I'll be moving to students' perception of literature. And the first problem is, I think that one of the most important problems is my students' linguistic and discourse competence. The students we teach at the higher institutes are not all of them, but most of them are not well equipped to read, understand, and appreciate the literary text. Take the example of Old English. If you introduce students to a text belonging, or say, for example, a Shakespearean text or other texts that are substantially called Old English, or that are written Old English, these students will find difficulties in understanding and deciphering the hidden codes within the text because of this outside linguistic deficiency. And accordingly, this leads to a lack of motivation, if you want, and enthusiasm when dealing with those texts, because they think that those texts are inaccessible. The second example, poetry. Poetry is another, if you want, extremely difficult subject for them, for students, because of the sophisticated images and the metaphors included in the poems. This leads me to talk about the personal engagement of students. As literature is about human experience, how can they make sense of what they're reading if they're not competent enough to decipher the codes of those texts? Accordingly, students do not know how to deal with human experience outside the model they live by. And here, I have the example, the extract from As You Like It, Act 2, Scene 7, the Shakespearean text. The teacher's enthusiasm to work on the Shakespearean text is faced with total disconnectedness, if you want, and lack of motivation, because students are unable to understand the text and see the meanings it generates. The first comment in front of the teacher's enthusiasm is, and so what? All the words are stage. And so what? How can I connect to these lines? And of course, unless you push your students to connect as human beings to this, and allow me to call it this existential experience within the Shakespearean text. You cannot really make sense of what is happening in this text. So the human experience is, according to me at least, is of a paramount importance to pushing students to appreciate the literature and the texts they are reading. The third point is cultural familiarity or unfamiliarity. To what extent are my students familiar with the target culture? That's another obstacle we need to face. Students' inability to see beyond the linguistic and technical structure of a literary text is, of course, one of the major problems we face when we teach literature. Their reading is informed by their cultural upbringing. All of us, we are readers of literary texts, and our starting point is the culture we lived in, right? So maybe most of the time this reading is informed by specific dimensions related to our culture. And accordingly, because they're not trained enough, those students may jump to easy conclusions and make value judgment. And I have here two very interesting examples to share with you. The first is related to the model of the flapper in the Great Gatsby, whereas the second, I'll be talking about Lady Olenska, or Ellen Olenska, in Wharton's The Age of Innocence. The flapper, a term used to describe a young woman's stylish, I'm sorry for the typo here, a woman with an A, lifestyle related to the glitz of America's roaring 20s. For my students, the flapper was synonymous with a prostitute. I was shocked. Then, this reading of the character, and then I understood what happened. This reading of the character emanated from their ethical and cultural norms, as they tended to judge the character in relation to the appearance and behavior. My students belong to a very specific, to a very conservative society, and accordingly, unless the elements describing this character do abide by those notions, they will put it outside the norms they know, and accordingly they will easily judge the character according to the experience they know, at least. The second is related to, as I said, to the character Ellen Olenska, which is who is a key character in Wharton's book. She was misjudged by her own society because she was getting a divorce. The negative image attributed to Ellen Olenska is a translation of the accusing social group she belongs to, what we call the New York community. When studying the character, the majority of my students reiterated the misogynist ideas in the text. They did not read against the text, if you want. They did not, thank you. In fact, they failed to take a critical distance, as they could not understand that the discourse presented was used to criticize the patronizing voice of Archer Newland, in particular, and the New York community in general. I'll be now moving to the alternatives, if you want. The first point is related to lectures and seminars. By adopting seminars as a form of academic instruction, the teacher will turn into a mediator rather than a giver of knowledge, and students will become active participants. Adopting a reader-response approach is beneficial, as students are invited to extract meaning and respond to the text. The second point is related to the variety and the number of the texts they should read in order to expose them to different literatures. Whereas the third point is related to the coordination with language teachers. It is very important. Content subjects and language subjects should work cooperatively to contribute to the training of our students. Motivation is also of a paramount importance. We should know how to motivate our students by setting clear objectives using aids like filmic adaptations, for example, visuals, extra readings, and so on. And we should be also varying those tasks given in class like oral presentations, group discussions, writing activities. Reading is we should be talking about active reading while reading those texts. Understanding processes of textual analysis and interpretation. Here, importance is given to perception by developing good skills for paying close attention to complex, connotative, nuanced literary details. And finally, we should develop critical distance, teaching students to read and write against texts in order to undermine ideology beyond them. We're moving to another level of interpreting and evaluation of texts. Reading against the text or developing critical distance is examining how it is embedded in and shaped by ideology. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Najjar. It really was an enlightening, very, very interesting presentation.